It's time for Wretched Radio with Todd Friel.
And away we go.
It's the Wretched Radio mail call delivery bag Q&A infotainment nationwide extravaganza featuring your voicemails, correspondences, communiques, dispatches, memorandums, and missives.
Any special message for all the kids watching at home?
What we need right now is a clear message to the people of this country.
You have 1,200 messages.
That is a bit above average.
Now here's your host, Todd, freakishly tall Friel.
The mail is here!
This is Wretched Radio. You can send questions, comments, conundrums, or snarks to idea@wretched.org. Idea@wretched.org. The stack keeps growing, so let's get busy, shall we? This sent in from Russell. Hey, Todd, I have an idea that may cause you to differ with you on your time frame conclusion on Monday's broadcast.
Nice
we were
stuttering.
Talking, you got that? That was my curmudgeonly sound. That was my, how dare you disagree with a radio host? Don't you know rule number one? We're always right about everything, especially that rule. We were talking about the collapse of our culture, which seems pretty apparent at this point, doesn't it? A sociologist concluding a lifelong study of 86 different countries concluded there is a pattern to the fall of a nation. And if you recall, he worked through different criteria, that's important, different criteria where he falsely concluded his observations excellent, his conclusions wrong, and his rationale for it very cloudy and confused. He admitted it himself. He believed that sexual mores lead the collapse of a culture. I disagree. I believe bad beliefs come first, then the bad mores follow, and then everything goes kafritz after that, because it is beliefs or lack thereof that cause the collapse of a culture. Nevertheless, his astute observations demonstrated that within 3 generations of a nation that embraces his criteria will experience a collapse. And a generation to him was 33 years. So now Russell is not the only one to write this. In fact, we had this conversation at home. Mrs. Friel brought up the same point. What about the Roaring 20s? Wasn't that the beginning? Not the 60s or the 70s or even the 80s and 90s, the Roaring 20s. And I think that's a great question and a great observation. And we always need to remember history, sociology, it's never crisp. It is never, this date, we flip the calendar, and everybody in culture started behaving and thinking like this. Doesn't happen that way. It's always just, little fuzzy. That's just the way history works. It's not neat and tidy. The reason, though, based on this sociologist's observation, he concluded it wasn't the 30s, which he lived in, by the way. He lived through the Roaring 20s. He still wasn't seeing, though, that is like the highlight of degradation. Now, the fellow who was doing a review of his work was observing. Now, if we say that the 70s is really when we started to see the beginning of the fruit of the sexual revolution of the 60s, we could use that as kind of our starting point for a generation, maybe the year 2000. Again, none of this is tidy, but call it the year 2000, that by the end of this century, we'll see the collapse of America. Now, why would I still say that that's probably more accurate than the Roaring 20s? Because, number one, I don't think the Roaring 20s. Now, Tony, you lived through the 20s.
I did.
Maybe you could help with this.
I was younger then.
Do you think that the Roaring 20s were as roaring as, say, the sexual revolution of the 60s, 70s, etc.?
Nowhere near.
See, that's what I thought, too. In Charleston Flappers, Razzmatazz, it was shocking. But even if you look at those women dancing in their flappers, not even... Think Madonna.
Nothing. Yeah.
Are you kidding? Think Beyonce today. Are you kidding me? Not to mention just the homosexual issue. I don't think this sociologist even imagined that would be a part of this, but it most certainly is. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But that was not a part of the Roaring 20s, at least not to the extent that it is today. Of course, that sin, like every other sin, always existed, but not like it does today. Pornography, I would still have to say, no, I think that the era we're living in really is the chapter where we can say, yep, we've turned a page on this whole sexual mores business. Second of all, the sociologist markers were very specific, if you recall. It wasn't just like some more sexual liberation. But again, I don't think the 20s compare to the. We're talking free love. I mean, we're talking communes. We're talking Laugh-In. We're talking then about the 70s and the sexual nature of art and literature. We're talking now through our day, which is accelerated, which is an interesting consideration, by the way, in all of this. This sociologist said 3 generations at the beginning of the sexual revolution, you can look for a society to become inert, not caring about architecture or literature, because the conclusion was you can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't have sexual liberation and human flourishing. You'll have one, but you can't have the other. Now, you can have it for the first generation, but then it's going to stop because they're not compatible. That's biblical. That's how I understand it. He simply observed it. But now, is it possible that we might see an acceleration of the degradation and the collapse of a nation because of technology? This is the first time that we've had lightning speed stuff, Daddy-O. We can get it here, there, and everywhere fast. And maybe a generation could be shrunk down to, say, 5 years for all we know. We'll see. But you'll recall his markers weren't just a little bit of promiscuity, maybe in some lounges someplace in the big city. It had to do with marriage, the attitude toward marriage, prenuptial fidelity, and then postnuptial. What was the view of chastity prior to marriage and faithfulness in marriage? The third criteria, if you recall, was how we observe and we explain reality. Is there a God? Is it all rationalistic? Is it all scientific? Is our explanation scientific? Or is it, we just don't really care, or it's just chance, or whatever? And so back in the 20s, even though they were roaring more than in past generations, nevertheless, there was a higher view of God, a more of a robust understanding. God made the place. He's the explanation for stuff. I know evolution was creeping in, but even that was one of the criteria that would suggest that a culture will still stay robust as long as there's something more high-minded than, nothing. And so based on his criteria, Russell, I would have to say, no, I think we're seeing the beginning of it now. And again, was it 1968, 1974? 1987. I don't know, but we're certainly there now, aren't we? Send your emails to idea@wretched.org. This sent in from Anani Moo, and this is an issue that not only are a lot of young people dealing with, but a lot of old people are concerned about. Without getting into all the details of this particular email, this particular person is wondering what to do because they attend a church where they're one of the minorities in that there's just very few young people. It's all gray-haired folks. Now, on the surface, you could easily just bat that away and say, well, so what? Learn from the old people. Well, okay, that's fair, but it gets a little bit more complicated than that. There's, some peer interaction. There's some gathering together. There's some receiving ministry and teaching with the context that is more familiar to you, and maybe to the pastor is more concerned about a particular demo than the other. So this is an issue for young people who attend a church like this, and it's a concern for older people because they're not seeing younger people come. So the younger people want to leave because there's no younger people there, and the older people want more younger people there. Now what do we do? It's not easy, to be honest about it. So what do you do? And I think the biblical answer is you preach the word. You just faithfully preach the word. You keep preaching the word. Whatever the issue is in church, my opinion, maybe naive, I like to think not, preach the word. You've got a division in your church, preach the word. You've got an immature church, maybe their theology is a little wonky around the edge, preach the word. You've got a demographic issue in the church, preach the word. I would say be careful of programs that try to change that balance. I understand they're not all horrible. You want to do an outreach, I get that. But don't start changing church to try to attract a demographic. And if you happen to be the minority demographic age-wise, I would encourage you to stay. I get the desire. I really do. But I think there's more benefits from learning from old people than just going around and hanging around with people that you're more comfortable with. Could you bring it to the attention of the elders? Absolutely. Bring it to the attention of the pastor. Hey, I just want you to know it's a struggle for us. Just want you to be aware. I'm not asking you to start wearing skinny jeans. Just want you to know that this is challenging for us. And if you could be mindful when you're preaching, our situation, we're not dealing with empty nest issues. our nests are getting kind of crowded, and we're kind of under that right now. So if you could just remember some of those things, and that would help us, because we'd like to stay and we'd like to learn and glean the maturity and the wisdom that is hard-won, that can only be received through years of living, and not abandon a place because of demographics. Now, I realize that's easier said than done. Nevertheless, would encourage you. There are advantages to being the whippersnappers. I promise you there are. And older people, don't neglect them. Don't look down on them. I would say you love on them with all the grandparently love that you possibly can, and give them that wisdom that you have won through years of parenting and work experience and life experience. Don't do it in an overbearing way, in a lecturing kind of way, but just love all over them. And regardless of age, remember, the gospel should simply wipe away that distinction. Send your emails to idea@wretched.org. This is Wretched Radio.